Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for session 6 of 6. We've reached the end of this series here. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get to some of the information today, I did want to say that even though this is the end of this series, if you missed any of our previous sessions, or if you happen to know somebody that would value this content, we do provide access to all of these past sessions. If you just click the link in the chat function, feel free to share that with any colleagues or anyone on your team. This is free information that we're providing just for the retail community here. And also in an effort to deliver relevant educational content, we're constantly reaching out to our network of experts for new ideas. And we're currently in development of new sessions in the weeks and months to come, and we'll certainly keep you informed as those unfold. Before I get over to Marc Weiss, I did want to discuss a couple of house rules as we usually do in these webinars. The first one being audio. We want to make sure that you can hear us as clearly as possible. So the GoToWebinar platform offers two options, computer or phone. Please use the best one for your system. Most importantly, this is an open panel discussion. We always save time at the end for you to ask direct questions directly to the panel or myself. So please use the questions panel right in GoToWebinar, and we can address those as they come in towards the end. Finally, the most important question that we get is, will there be a recording? Absolutely yes. We send out a recording directly after these sessions, and we also include past sessions on our YouTube channel, and I can include a link in chat for that as well. But before we get into the information, who is Management One? For those of you who are not familiar with our company, thank you for joining us. Our purpose is to provide financial security for our people, our clients, and our affiliates. And we deliver merchandise intelligence and education for independent retailers like you. We deliver this through a variety of core values that are important to us, with a generous heart, courage, curiosity, adaptability, commitment, and collaboration. And we've also made a special commitment to increase racial and ethnic diversity in our company and our network to contribute to improving racial and social justice in America, and we're going to continue to do so. But without further ado, I will turn it over to CEO of Management One, Marc Weiss.
Well, thank you very much, Nico. Thank you also, Paul, who's joining me today on this webinar, and thank you to all of you who participated and are listening in. One of my favorite topics is to talk about acres of diamonds. Russell Conwell delivered this speech over 6,000 times in the late 1890s. Excuse me, forgot to turn off my phone. That's a mistake. All right, sorry about that. Diamonds, it's a story about a man who sold his farm and traveled the world and sought fame and fortune, and only after a lifetime of seeking fame and fortune came home penniless and broke and bankrupt back to his property, only to find out that the property he sold had diamonds on it, and he could have been fabulously rich and had a diamond mine. So the whole concept in what we do is to look for diamonds in your own backyard, and those are in your own business. And through the use of data, we can uncover some of those diamonds and help you find ways that you can look for opportunities and seize them. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Brian Tracy. He's a motivational speaker. I love this quote: the more you seek security, the less of it you have. But the more you seek opportunity, the more likely it is that you will achieve the security you desire. So you got to be able to look for those opportunities, mitigate risk, but still take risk. You're all in the retail business, so you're by your profession, demands you to take risk, but unnecessary risk can also have unintended consequences. So there's always this balance of risk and non-risk in whatever you pursue. And the idea of using data is to help you mitigate that risk and yet find opportunities that you can seize. By the way, Brian Tracy did a phenomenal, I listened to it over 30 years ago, but he did a phenomenal series on the psychology of selling. And you're all in the business of selling. And I would highly recommend, if you want to take that tape out and listen to it again. There's lots of great content about the selling process and how to look at selling from a psychological point of view. It's good stuff. So a pickaxe is to unearthing diamonds, as data is to unearthing opportunities in your business. And the message here is really that it takes work. I mean, it doesn't happen by accident. You have to know what data to look for, how to use the data, what to measure, how to measure it. And what we're going to go through today is to give you specific examples of what data you should be looking at, how to look at it, where to look for it, just like you would use a pickaxe to unearth diamonds. It's hard work. I mean, think about the sweat and the brow, people working in diamond mines. Well, looking for data and finding opportunities isn't necessarily easy. It takes hard work, it takes time, it takes your willingness to invest the time to do that. So there's an idea, and then this goes to the idea of data versus chance. There's a concept called the gambler's fallacy. And the gambler's fallacy is really about frequency. If you flip a coin in the air and it comes up heads or tails, it's a 50-50 chance it'll either come up heads or it'll come up tails. But some people carry it further a little along the way, and they'll say, well, the heads has come up 5 times in a row, so I'm going to bet on tails. Well, the fact of the matter is there's still a 50-50 chance on that next coin toss flip that'll happen. Well, this goes to how people bet at roulette or at cards or gambling. They look at the frequency of events and try to guess, well, I think this hasn't happened for a long time, so this will happen. Well, think about how you equate that to retail. You know, we've been selling the skinny leg denim for 5 years really well. I don't think we're going to sell it anymore, so you stop buying it, even though the data shows that you can, the data shows that there's still demand left for it. And there's one vendor that I can think of in particular where I know a lot of retailers gave up on it, and yet that skinny leg denim sold well, was the best-selling denim they had for 11 years. So I think that retailers or anybody in business can, you know, make decisions based on the frequency of events, anticipating that they're going to change without really supporting data. The reverse of that concept is that you make a decision to not carry something because it didn't do well. So I think that there's both sides of the coin. You can look at frequency of events and use them in a way that they're not necessarily true in decision making. It's granted you'll be right 50% of the time, but you'll also be wrong 50% of the time. So the gambler's fallacy says it creates deceptive biases that lead you to anticipate patterns that may not really exist. So if you know where to look in your data, you can better anticipate those patterns and make better decisions and put the odds in front of you instead of behind you. I think this whole idea of intuitiveness and the art and science of retail kind of get clouded at times. And one of the things that we want to talk to you about today is, you know, you have to be an artist. You have to make gut decisions. There's no question about that. But you can use data to help mitigate that and make it more successful. So there's also this thing, well, there's data can lead to paralysis, and too much data is overwhelming, and you know, how do I make decisions, and there's too many reports and so forth. But but you can break this down, and there's rules that you can use for data, and there's rules that we use. First of all, data is only important if you can make a decision on it. So can I take this data? What does it mean? How do I make a decision with it? If you can't make a decision on it, then you don't need it. When you come to making decisions, is it measurable? So if you can't measure it, then it's really not something you want to spend your time with. It's, you know, people say, what's the difference between an excuse and a reason? Well, an excuse isn't measurable, a reason is. So when you're trying to make a decision on something, ask yourself, can I measure the results of this decision? And a lot of decisions can be measured. The whole idea of measurement is to make a decision, then measure it, see what the results are, and then decide if you need to get off of it, continue with it, change it. But the things that you work on in your business, from your assortments to your hiring to how you pay people, those are all measurable things. I mean, how many people come in your store and conversion rates, these are all measurable things. Should I have a traffic counter? Shouldn't I have a traffic counter? Well, of course you should have a traffic counter, because you want to measure how many people come in your store, and you want to measure how many people you convert those sales to. And you want to measure how many items per transaction they have, and so forth. But there are things that you want to measure on a regular basis. Determine metrics on a dashboard that identify changes in your business. This is important. So the frequency that you measure different metrics, some will be daily, some will be weekly, some will be monthly. But metrics that you measure should be things that you can make a decision on and reflect changes in your business. Am I going to use data to make decisions, or am I just going to wing it? And this goes back to the gambler's fallacy. Are we going to run our business by chance, or are we going to run our business by decisions? And I think one of the things that that Paul's going to talk to you about now is how you leverage that data.
Thanks, Mark. And hello, everybody. This is Paul. This is one of the reasons why I never take Marc Weiss to Las Vegas with me. He makes too much sense. Look, I think everyone can agree that data-driven decision-making can really help a retailer work towards their key financial business goals. And leveraging data rather than just merely shooting in the dark is really what we're going to be talking about at this webinar. But when it comes to inventory, which data are we talking about? And are we looking at it correctly? See, I think there's been a data paradigm. It puts a box around our decision making. We tend to look at data, pretty much typically retailers look at data the same way all the time, every day. And sometimes they don't really focus on the real practical problem solving that data can expose. And so I'd like to start actually with the whole idea of classifications and the classification structure itself within a retail store. What makes a good class structure, or a bad one for that matter? So I'd like to start out, number one, with some facts about category theory, so to speak, inventory classification theory. Number one, that classifications, a good classification should reflect how your customers shop. They're the measurement of what your customers are telling you, how they look at your merchandise. And number two is, in a good classification, that the inventory within them are interchangeable. Now, what do I mean by interchangeable? Well, let's say a customer walks into a hardware store, let's say, and he goes over to the hardware department looking for an extension cord. Well, the extension cord area is actually the classification. But under the classification, there's lots of other subcategories and other ways to look at the information within extension cords, for that matter. For example, you could look for an indoor or an outdoor extension cord. You could look for a 4-foot or a 6-foot extension cord. You could look for pricing and different price points on extension cords. But the class itself, I think in this case, would be extension cords because they're somewhat interchangeable. And by the way, one other thing too about categories that's important, this is particularly, I think, true in the fashion business. Classifications need to be permanent. What do I mean by permanent? They're not based on fads. They're not based on the trend of the day. The category itself, let me give you an example. Skirts. Skirts is a good classification in a women's boutique. Why is that? Because women wore skirts 100 years ago. They wear skirts today, and they'll probably wear skirts 100 years from now. But what changes is whether they're mini skirts or maxi skirts or linen skirts or polka dot skirts, or all of those fashion attributes tend to change based on the fashion whims. But to really look at your information properly, skirts is the correct level. And finally, classifications project trends, which gets back to the whole customer focus part of category management. How does your customer shop? And in what ways are your customers changing? And we are seeing today, because of what we've all gone through with COVID-19, fundamental changes. COVID-19 has accelerated these changes that good category structures need to somewhat change too. And Marc, I think you've got a really good example of exactly what I'm talking about.
Well, thank you, Paul. And I actually want to thank one of our affiliates, Neil Esserman. He called me over the weekend, and he started to talk about active lifestyle. And, we get data in every single day. And, the customer, you talked about being customer focused. Well, what are the customers buying today? They're buying active lifestyle brands. They're buying active lifestyle merchandise. And you can actually categorize this. There's performance-based active wear that would be in outdoor stores and bicycle shops and running stores. There's casual tailored lifestyle, and that's going to be shirts and casual pants and something that's a little bit more structured. Then there's lounge wear. There's a joke about I've got my morning jammies and my evening jammies. There's advanced contemporary, where it's a more of a casual, elegant, casual inspired at a higher price point. There's yoga inspired. I mean, think about Lululemon, and we talk about this all the time amongst ourselves that here's one of the largest retailers in the world selling yoga inspired wear, and many of our retailers are challenged to get into that mode, and yet they open up stores and are doing billions of dollars worth of business just in one niche. And then of course there's elevated streetwear, and fleece and hoodies are a big part of that, but that also intersects with mainstream retail. I mean, think about lines like Champion, which Champion's been around forever, got very hot in the elevated streetwear market, and now it's in more mainstream stores. So when you begin to look at active lifestyle, you can break it down into these categories, and in each of these categories, there's t-shirts, there's graphic tees, there's sweatpants, there's yoga pants, there's khakis, there's 5-pocket denim, 5-pocket non-denim, then there's more casual, elegant looks, and so forth. So when you get into this, there's a lot of business to be done, and these pictures actually do a great job. There's outerwear as well. These pictures do a great job, illustrating that this is a focus. And as retailers begin to think about what's coming in for fall and next spring, are you customer focused? Is what you bought pre-COVID and the assortments you created pre-COVID the same assortments that you want to bring in that will drive your business in the next 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months? This is an example. This is a little bit different example, but when we talk about data, this is actually comes from one of our clients that had a sunglass category, and it was just sunglasses, and they did about $110,000 or $120,000 a year. And now that they decided to break it down into vendors, and it now produces almost 88,000 in July, just in not in 1 year but in 1 month. And look at you can look at Paul will go over the balance and the opportunities that are here, but they're buying into the vendor. They have the right inventory by vendor. They're making the right purchases by vendor. They had a 25% increase in volume in July because they're now assorting their assortment about sunglasses is they still do a good sunglass business, but they also do a Costa business, a Maui Jim business. The managers get to buy sunglasses in the stores, Oakley business, and Ray-Ban. And there's some missed opportunity here as well. Paul will illustrate it. We've got it highlighted.
Yeah, thanks, Marc. My view on this is that let's take Oakley, for example. Now, we had a planned sale for Oakley. We thought Oakley would do $9,200 last month, and they really fell short at only $6,900. Now, this, remember, is a sunglass business that at the top, at the helicopter view, did $88,000 against our goal of $85,000. So why did Oakley do so poorly? Well, I think there's a couple of tells within this data. The first tell is, I think we all realize that what drives sales is new merchandise. And I know Mark and I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago that really showed that kind of, that how important it is, the flow of new inventory coming into your stores every week, literally. In this case, we can see how much merchandise in Oakley arrived in the last 90 days. We've received $13,000 worth of Oakley product. The sales were $24,000 for the last 90 days. Now, that would mean if you're only bringing in 13 over a quarter and you sold 24, what you're literally doing is you're selling off your Oakley inventory. And that would have a profound impact in terms of the business you're doing. And that is probably one of the key reasons why Oakley is suffering to the way it is. Oakley is sitting with inventory right now of about 9,400. That is about 20% under where they should be. And also the inventory is probably old. And so these are the things that you can go and look at a category like this. Now, the nice thing about this that I'm looking at, and I think Mark would agree with this, is this retailer has actually, we're jumping on the problem. If we look over what's coming in Oakley, only Costa sunglasses has as much coming on order as we have in Oakley. So we are going to beef that up, and I think that will solve the problem that's only temporary right now. I don't know, Mark, if you've got anything else to add to that.
No, I think that's well said. I mean, and again, Paul's not looking at what's already performed well. He's looking at where the opportunity exists within the data to take advantage and grow the business. And I think that's the critical thing here. And then, classifications at times can be vendors. Brands are important, and if you've got a brand that's category killer or drives a lot of volume, there's nothing wrong with looking at it that way and then having it bubble up to a larger category or class.
Mark, do you want to take this one, or do you want?
Yeah. So this is another example of what the cash margin is, what the gross margin is, and what the efficiency is. By doing it by brand, we actually get the sell-throughs very fast. We get the sell-throughs at the total level at 80%. But you can begin to look at about the amount of cash margin dollars that are being generated, not just gross margin dollars, but cash margin dollars that are being generated by breaking it down this way, and also by location. You can see the locations that are performing better than the other locations.
And let me just jump in there too, Mark. So, oftentimes, in fact, I just spoke with a retailer last week that had the same problem, and he said, oftentimes he'll finish his year with a nice profit, but not as much cash in the checking account. And there's a big difference between cash margin and gross margin. I've often said in presentations that one of the most leading metrics in accounting is cost of goods sold, because it is essentially what it is. It says what it is. It's the old thing is that if someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. And if someone says this is cost of goods sold, you should believe that too. And let me explain what I'm talking about. Cost of goods sold means that is the profit on what you've sold. So let's go through something very simple. You received 20 widgets, and 5 months later, you sold 5 at full price. Well, your cost of goods sold on those 5 you sold at full price would be wonderful. Your cost of goods purchased, or cash margin, which is what we have up here, would be horrific because you had to pay for 20 and only sold 5. This is a concept that we believe in very, very strongly at Management One. We think it's almost impossible to have a store that does poorly if cash flow is strong. And so this report that Mark was sharing with you is critical. If our cash margin is 216, but our gross margin is 190, we're actually doing a very, very good job. And that we translate also in the GMROI and CMROI. By the way, this is something that I think no one has really spoke about other than Management One over the past years. Gross margin return on investment is a metric that we all understand, but what we believe in is cash margin return on investment. It's the same concept. What is your cash margin against how much inventory have you got tied up in stock? And that is a much better, more important metric. And you can see right here that the total here is a better cash margin than they have in terms of gross margin. I don't know, Mark, if you want to add anything to that, but I think this is a really important report.
No, we talked about it last week. I think the inventory performance report is the balance sheet of your inventory. It tells you the health of it. Are you creating cash? Are you turning it? Are you selling it through? Those are the key ingredients of whether a class is working for you or not. And in some of these classes and some of these vendors, it's better than others. And it's important to know that. So they're not all the same.
So we've talked about vendors, but that's just one way that retailers will break out their classifications. And there's other ways too. What I'm showing you here is a report for a retailer that has taken his denim jeans and he's decided to break it out into what he would call core or basic, probably reorderable merchandise, and then his fashion, which I would imagine would be one-off fashion. And so let me explain what we're looking at here. Last month we had a target for sales in his jean business last month at $36,710. His actual sales last month were $41,009. So excellent month, beat the plan handily, beat the target handily. And let's drop over here and see where the inventory is. Right now his inventory is at $128,000, and where he should be, the benchmark, it's important to have benchmarks. The benchmark's 124. So this is a little bit like hand grenades and horseshoes, everybody. You can't get exactly to the target. Close is good enough, and in this case, his inventory is slightly above plan, but then, of course, so are sales. Now, in an effort to dig down deep and drill down, what's going on underneath that? So he decided to break it into core and fashion. What we see last month is that these two subcategories, in terms of sales, did almost the same amount. The core jeans did 12,142. Fashion did 11,592. We have equal amounts of business, at least last month, from those two possibly different customers. But let's go over and see the amount of inventory we have. In this case, core inventory at 28,963 retail against 12,000 sold looks pretty good, I would say, in terms of sell-through. But fashion, after selling 11,592, is only sitting on 14,000, which is barely a month's supply if everything is perfect and what's left on inventory. So you can see right now that we have a huge variance and probably a lot more juice out of this orange relative to fashion. If we just beef up the inventory, we can expect, this data is showing us that we will do more business in that subcategory if we start building the assortment and giving the customers more to choose from. Now, this also brings up one last question that Marc actually yesterday brought up in one of our meetings, and he said, but Paul, what about what's everything else? And so let's talk about that for a second, because remember, these were simply two subcategories this retailer broke out. There's others. And in this case, he did 41,000, but he did 23,000 in these two categories, which left 18,000 in other types of jeans. And the inventory, which was at 128, but the two categories we broke out were at about total 43, means there was $85,000 in merchandise that we haven't broken out yet, that we don't know what it is yet, that only produced $18,000 in sales. And so not only have we learned a little bit about how his business is really shaping up and where the opportunities, we're learning about the problems. Now, this also can be broken down further, because what I didn't tell you about this retailer is he has 3 stores. And so when we look at the core jeans now by store, an entirely different profile emerges. Because if you look at the core jeans, where we looked at it from the company total, where we had 28,000 in inventory and sold 12, and remember I said, that looked pretty good, that's about right. But then we look at store 1, 2, and 3 over to the left. Store 1, clearly the flagship store, sold $7,500 in core jeans last month. Their inventory, 8,200. In fact, of the 3 stores, the flagship and the 2 satellite stores, flagship has less inventory in core jeans than the flagship stores do, the satellite stores do, with the lion's share of sales. Now let's look down to fashion. It even gets worse, everybody. For where we knew we were tight at 14 and sold 11, when we look at flagship, we sold almost 7,000. We have a little under 5,000 left. This is how we start to drill down. We drill down by subcategory, and then we drill down by store. And those are the diamonds that we're talking about. This is a good way to look at your inventory. Now, let's expand that out into some other ways to look at data, if you will. I want to start out by also talking about breaking out women's tops. This is a retailer that decided to break out tops, women's tops, into casual, dressy, and basic. It's a pretty good way to break it out, I think. But what's happening here in casual is very, very interesting, because casual business is almost twice as much in terms of sales for the last 90 days, for the last month, as dressy. So we're doing almost twice as much in casual as we are in dressy. But when we pull this all the way across and look at the on order, the actual on order in casual tops at 37,000 and the on order in dressy at 29, we're buying these two categories now about equally in terms of quantity. But one is outselling the other by double. And I think that is probably due, and this is live data, to what's happening today in retail in terms of apparel. Casual outselling dressy. Unfortunately, in this case, we would probably have a prayer meeting with this retailer about why is he still buying as many dress tops as he is casual.
And Paul,
Now, yes,
I
Mark.
just want to add something to that, because I think you make
Right.
a really great point here. And that is the assortments that I talked about earlier. This is a great example of the assortments that you created pre-COVID for your fall and next spring deliveries may not be in line with where your customer is at today, and the need to chase and make sure that the assortments you're creating reflect current demand.
Very good point. Thank you, Mark. Let's drop down to look at jewelry for a second. Why do I want to look at jewelry? Well, you know, we can look at all the successes we want, but let's look at some struggling categories. And again, let's talk about why. We hinted at that when we looked at Oakley sunglasses. But when we look at data like we do at Management One every single day, it does become a pattern where we're not receiving, where we're selling off inventory. When in the case of jewelry, where we have a goal of $5,800 in sales last month, and we fell far short of that at $3,600. And then look at how much new product in jewelry has arrived in the last 90 days, 6,200. And what we sold in the last 90 days, 12,800. And we have the same concept here that we saw in Oakley. We have, in this case, an inventory where at $24,000, $8,000 above benchmark. Why was so much inventory, more inventory than any other accessory category, do so poorly? Because again, it's not how, in the fashion business, it's not how much you have, it's how much new you have. Jewelry is extremely perishable. And what this retailer has to do is start moving on some of the old product, and he has to start buying, because problem number 4 or 5 down the list here of his jewelry is the fact that we have a $17,000 inflow plan, and the on order is, let me add that up for a second. Oh, that's a goose egg. We don't have anything coming at all. Let's look at jewelry a little bit further. We'll just pick on this retailer for a second. This is a different way to look at data. Sales, inventory, inflow. How much business are we doing? How much do we own in stock? And how much of it's come in? What's our inflow? In this case, the same store, jewelry, 22% of the accessory business in his store is done in jewelry. 33% of the inventory that he has in jewelry is of accessories is in jewelry. And here is and if you want to know why sales have been sluggish, only 18% of new product in the accessory category is in jewelry. These are just different ways of looking at data, of how to slice and dice, because everybody has to understand that today's business is all about trending and hustle. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think if you're in business today, you know hustle is everything. Hustle is getting customers in the store. Hustle is getting product on the shelves. Hustle is how to market your store. And data only means something, only means anything if we are willing to use it and to hustle and to look forward. How are we trending? What is performing? What's struggling? And how fast can we act and move on these type of things? Let's look at, in this case, a shoe store. Now, the first thing I would say when I would open up this class progress report, and let me explain what we're looking at here. This is a day-to-day report on how we're trending in your store. In other words, today is, let's say today's the 15th of the month. How are we trending as of last night against our forecast? And by the way, let me talk about a forecast for just one moment. One of the missing ingredients, I think, in too many retailers around the United States and Canada today is we don't have a forecast. We don't have a benchmark. What should we be doing in sales? That's the key on how we analyze how we are doing. For example, in fashion sandals, women's fashion shoes and sandals, and in casual shoes, we should have 16,794 in the till, so to speak, today, or in 15,178 in fashion shoes. And you can see where we are as of last night, falling far short. What do I mean by hustle? Let's not wait until the end of the month. We clearly have a problem here. But let's look at something that maybe looks a little more appetizing. Athletic shoes. Again, back to what Marc talked about in terms of the trend in casualness, in people not, going to cocktail parties. People are out walking and jogging, and athletic shoes, female athletic shoes, is actually, the forecast is right now where we should be at 32.5. We're at 30,800. So let's dig a little deeper here. And maybe this is something that we should look at by our stores. This is a 3-store operation down here on women's athletic shoes. Now let's look over what we were last year. Now, if you can see how things change quickly. Last year, we sold $13,000 in Orbitville. By the way, these are made up names, everybody. Don't look for them on a map. Shoeville had $21,877 in sales last year. And Footwear City was at $95.54. Look at the difference on where we're trending right now. In other words, Footwear City is right now at $91.59 in sales, trending to do $10,515, which is a $1,000 increase. And what happened in Shoeville? Because Shoeville right now, last year, the #1 store and almost half of our revenue is down now to a third. So what we're also suggesting is that your business, if you have multiple stores, multiple doors, can be shifting based on demographics and where each store is from within the last 12 months on what's happening. And we see that also in our client base. So there's an old saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road is going to get you there. A blueprint is a guide for making something. It's a design, it's a pattern that can be followed. If you want to build a really great tree house, drop a blueprint and follow the design carefully. The literal meaning of a blueprint is a paper that's blue with plans to build something, like a merchandise plan. A merchandise plan is a blueprint for a profitable retail business. And a blueprint helps you figure out exactly what to do in your business. Let's take, for example, these darn athletic shoes for a second. And let's look at it one other way as we dice and slice this category. Here's those athletic shoes that our goal is 37, our trend is 35. But let's look at a different trend. Let's look at our inventory. Because the current inventory is at 240,000, and our benchmark based on our blueprint is 267. And based on what we have still on order and where our trend is in sales through the rest of the month, our trend at the end of the month is not going to be at 240. It is certainly not going to be where we should be at 267, but we're falling off and being at 233. That's not part of the blueprint. We're lowering inventory in a business that's growing. Now, in this case, thankfully, this retailer is recognized it again, like we saw in the sunglass, and we do have a substantial on order. In fact, the $132,000 on order in athletic shoes is pretty close to where we should be because we only have 16,000 left based on the trend to open to buy. So we have filled those orders. But this is simply another way to look at data. Now, one of the things that Marc brought up to me yesterday is that, if you go on a journey and you have a map and you go 300 miles out of your way, you're going to spend a lot more gas than you should have, which is yes, that is true. These aren't just blueprints, they're maps. The map of where you want to be. So let's look at a client of ours that a women's store. It's a boutique, single store. Right now our trend is 757. That's their sales trend. This is the thing that this retailer without a blueprint, without a map, would know. How much inventory do we have today? $132,000 at retail. How much do we have coming? We have 23,000 at cost coming in this month. We have 7,000 coming in next month, and we have 4,000 coming in the month after. That's it. We know how much business we sold last year too, by the way. That's without a blueprint. With a blueprint, what we know is this. We want to be on January 1, which should be a low part of the inventory. We want to have 118,000 at retail. That's on a $750,000 store. That's where we want to be. That's the blueprint. That's the end of the journey, or the map, as Mark put it. So to get from here, where we are in inventory, 132, to there, we need a certain amount of product. And that is the open to buy. Because what we have left to spend is the blueprint in terms of how much more should we be buying to make sure that we're feeding the right amount of inventory. And when this can happen efficiently, and this isn't a huge store, this is a women's boutique, and we can have data like this. We can have a gross profit of 63% down below here. It's not highlighted. We can have 63% gross profit, and we can have sales during a pandemic that are up 10, 11%, and markdowns in a fashion store running only 9%. Those are the kind of metrics that count. That's the report card that one can achieve if you use the correct blueprint. So I want to turn it over to Marc, because he's going to talk a little bit more about looking forward and building your future. And so Marc, I'm going to let you wrap everything up.
Well, thank you, Paul. If you could just go back to that slide for a second, Paul. I just want to also point out that this is all about using data to make decisions. These are the diamonds in your own backyard. By flowing inventory correctly, the way Paul suggested, and doing it in the right class structure, you don't have to guess at your business. You need to start with a great class structure. You need to identify a class structure that's going to work for you in the next 6 months or 12 months. Class structures are permanent, but they don't have to be written in granite. And then you've got to peak and valley your inventory. So, and that's how you capture market share. Many of you are going to be looking at a lot less competition in the next 6 months. And I think that's a good thing, because you have an opportunity to bring in vendors you didn't have before. You have an opportunity to do things that you didn't do before. Now, if we can flip to that next screen. So don't be nostalgic about your business. Nostalgia can be the enemy of your future. If you always do what you've always done, they say you'll always get what you've always got. But today, in today's world, if you always do what you've always done, you're not going to get what you've always got, and you're going to get less. And if you're sitting with a lot of inventory in classes that you're not seeing any action or any sales, even if you mark them down, don't be buying back into that. Look for where your customer is. Look for where you can build them. Look at all those different activewear classes that we came up with, casual wear classes, that your customers have an appetite for or are hungry for. So don't always do things, and don't be so rooted in your business that you're unwilling to change. And that goes for every type of store out there. You know, I think it's interesting that, you know, our women's stores are bringing in casual shoe lines to mix up with their and so are many of our men's stores bringing in and bringing in other lines that they can sell with the athletic view of the comfort casualness of their customers. And vendors are going to be producing lines that reflect this. And yet I find some stores are resistant to change. If you're a shoe store and you're selling a lot of comfort casual performance sneakers, we'll bring in some apparel to support it. Don't be nostalgic about who we are and buttonhole yourself. Think of your customer as a lifestyle customer and what they're willing to purchase from you. They trust you, they know you. So I think retailers today need to think outside the box and not just think in terms of the brands that they're going to carry, but also think in terms of the lifestyle and the assortments that they need to carry and understand. I mean, the number one thing that Paul presented on a class structure is it customer focused? In the same way, we've had webinars about your e-commerce. It all comes down to knowing and understanding who your customer is and building a business around them, and then building assortments around feeding them, and then using data to analyze it to make decisions. It's working, it's not working. Don't just look at your best performers, look at your worst performers, because you need to turn those into cash to buy more of your best performers. I think many retailers feel like when COVID's over, things are going to go back to normal. Well, they're not. Customer behavior is unpredictable. There's no way to know what the customer is going to look like a year from now, but you can read what the customer is doing today and plan for it. And if you think if you think your pre-COVID business is going to be your post-COVID business, you're not going to be around to enjoy it. Then there's a better.
Sorry.
There is a better tomorrow out there if you're willing to hustle, as Paul talked about, adapt, and measure your decisions. Hustle is critical. Adapting is about not being stuck in the past, and measuring is all about, being open and being honest with yourself and measuring what you've done and making decisions on it. And if you do that, there is a very bright future for you and for all of us. And by the way, we practice what we preach. If we measure, we have measurements at our company. We're looking at data every single day from the thousands of stores we get data from. We're looking at what's happening on a day-to-day basis. We're building that. We're learning from it. We're trying to understand the future. We have a more global view of the world, but you have a very good view of your customer at a very grassroots level. And measuring that and looking at it and understanding that is mission critical. So Paul and Nico, I think we have some questions.
We do. Before I get to the questions, though, I did want to touch on one thing you were saying there at the end, Marc, talking about people moving online in stores. You mentioned way earlier in the discussion about having a traffic counter in a store, for example, and measuring all of the data that comes into your store. With so many folks moving online now with COVID, you have a built-in traffic counter on your website that basically follows your customers around the store. Imagine if you had that in your retail store. You have that online. And even if you don't have sales, you do have traffic. You can see which pages, which products customers are interested in. And if you follow some of the trends on your interest line on your website, that could also uncover some interesting diamonds as well.
Yeah, I'm really grateful because we get Google Analytics, and I've got Nico to interpret them for me because I don't know how to understand all those graphs and all that data. But we measure our leads, we measure our prospects, we measure the hits on our website, Nico measures a lot of things to build business and understand, what our customers are interested in and what they're not interested. You can do the same thing. Good point.
Absolutely. So questions here. Lisa actually had a really good question early on when you were talking about classification, and she was asking, can a trend like masks become a classification?
It's a great question. Yes, I mean, we've probably the number one class we've broken out either as a child or subclass or a planning class in the last 3 months has been masks, and it's been huge. And that's probably got a longer trend life than, we don't know what the trend life is going to be, but we're going to measure it and understand it, but it continues to accelerate. It's a great business to be in.
And you and Paul also mentioned in some of these reports, you're talking about class benchmarks and targets. How are those benchmarks or targets created?
Well, Paul, you want to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question that I could go on for an hour, but I'll shorten it up. So we're talking about let's talk about two different benchmarks. There are more than that, but let's talk about projecting sales and let's talk about projecting inventory, which is really the key to planning. So when we're looking at sales, we look at history, and history is very important to us. Now, not just last year's history, but we try to look at 2 to 3 years worth of historical information because 1 year can be full of anomalies. I live in Minnesota. We could have a snowstorm in October and close down for a week, every retailer here in the Twin Cities. So there could be anomalies in 1 year, but when we start looking at history in multiple years, we really then smooth out those anomalies, and we can then look at more accurate information. And the other thing we look at is we're very scientific in how we do look at trending. We've talked a lot about trending on this call and this webinar, but trending is actually very, very scientific, and a number of things that need to be looked at when we come to projecting a positive trend. How strong is the trend? Are we up in sales, but what were the months that we were up in, and how strong were those months? Was it profitable sales? How new was the inventory? Those are just some of the criteria that we look like, and there's literally dozens. We have actually a document, if anyone's interested, we would share with them on how to really look accurately at trending. And then the second benchmark, I think, that I just want to touch on briefly is inventory. The inventory benchmark is important because inventories are planned based on how fast or how many times we want to rotate our inventory in and out of our business over the course of a year, sort of like sell-through. But inventory turnover is looked at on a more longer period of time, half a year, more typically a year. And so the inventory is planned based on peaks and valleys, based on your sales history and when the customers come in and want that product and when they don't. And it's also based on ratios of how much inventory we should have to sales. I know I'm listening to myself right now, by the way, and I'm sounding really wonky, but how much inventory we should have to sales based on weeks or months supply. And that's really I think maybe the two key benchmarks that I at least touched on this presentation. What's the benchmark for sales? What's our goal? And then what's the benchmark for inventory?
Excellent. Thanks,
Okay,
Paul.
I just want to add to that. It was a great answer. I just want to add to that for those of you that are M1 clients and you have child classes, that's part of the diamonds in your backyard. If you have a child class that's doing over $25,000 annually, that class may have potential that needs to be examined and looked at and surfaced. I mean, it could be a $50,000 or $100,000 class if you looked at it a little differently or planned it. So there are diamonds in everyone's backyard, and I would encourage everyone to look at their classification structure and see if it's valid for today's business.
That's actually a really good segue, because the next question from Michelle, she was asking, how do I get, you guys showed all of those detailed reports there with vendors. How do you get these pretty detailed reports with vendor detail on them?
Well, it's a great question. And we don't, planning by vendor is a very specific way to look at it. You don't want to plan everything by vendor. I mean, Paul talked about concrete permanent classes, and customers do buy by class. But there are times where sometimes a vendor is a category killer. When Brighton was a really, really strong line and we had Brighton stores, we obviously, or Brighton store-in-stores. When a vendor represents such a significant part of the classification, it might pay to break it out. But it's not something normal. If you've got a vendor that is an it vendor, drives a lot of business, then it makes sense. But this is really a conversation you should have with your consultant and really talk about it. There are times that it's appropriate, there's times that sometimes if you get a vendor that represents 80 or 90% of the business in that category, that classification, that doesn't really leave room to grow the classification beyond the vendor. So by breaking out that vendor and then providing dollars into other vendors, you can actually increase the sales in that classification. And that sunglass example was a good example where they did 110 or 120,000 just in sunglasses. After we broke it out, they still did 110 or 120,000 in sunglasses, but did hundreds of thousands of dollars in other vendors. So it really is a thoughtful and purposeful approach to how to create a proper class structure, and something that you should take time considering. But vendor classifications are not universal or necessary, but they are important in certain verticals, in certain stores, for specific reasons. And I always like to think of them as, when they're a category killer, when they consume so much of your open to buy dollars.
You keep giving me these great segues because the next question was about class structure. Our attendee's asking, how will I know what class structure works best for my store?
Well, again, another great question. We'll certainly be glad to look at it for you and see what you have, because we actually know what good class structures are for stores because we do a lot of them. We see how they're working. So one step is to have us look at it. But I think you have to look at, what is it that you sell? I mean, if you sell tops, that's a very global look, but do you sell tank tops? Do you sell knits? Do you sell long sleeve and short sleeve? Do you sell fleece? Do you sell hoodies? I mean, what is the component? What is it that the customers are paying? Are they graphic tees or basic tees? If you have a t-shirt category, you should absolutely break them up into graphic tees and basic tees, because they both have to be fed, because there's demand for both. Tank tops, there's dressy and there's casual, but tank tops should always be broken out if you're a women's store. In men's, you've got knits, you have short sleeve and long sleeve knits, you've got polos, you've got t-shirts. It just depends on the nature of your business and how you buy for your customer and how your customer buys from you. But the breakdown of looking at your business will create a structure that'll give you peace of mind and buy, and you'll be able to actually begin to see the demand. What's important is that you see the demand as the customers make this buying decisions, because every time they buy, as Dennis Levine likes to say, they like to vote, and you're adding up those votes. So if you don't have a good classification structure, you can't have a ballot with enough candidates on it to know what to do. So the classification structure really reflects how your customers are voting on the categories you have. And again, we're happy to look at what you're doing and make suggestions. I just want to say, if you have too many classes, it's not good. If you have too few classes, it's not good. I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Thanks, Mark. Let me just say this about classification structure. And if you're not sure if your class structure is correct or not, classification structures are always evolving. I think Mark talked about that when he talked about the evolution now into leisure wear. If you looked at stores, like even women's boutiques from 10, 15 years ago, the typical class structure they had then and what they have today is different. One of the most dramatic changes that we ever saw, this was a few years ago, Management One does a lot of business with college bookstores around the country. And we were in a college bookstore and we asked to see their category structure, and he really hadn't cleaned it up. And he said, well, this one, some of these have been a little old. So we looked at it. The first one we saw was he had a category called typewriters. Well, that was something he didn't carry any typewriters, but it was just an example of what may appear to be permanent. What I talked about in classifications may end up not being permanent. They may end up changing. And so that is the evolution. And too many retailers, I think, should be more willing to change their category structures and to look at what Mark was talking about, subcategories, these child classes. An example of that was what we showed in terms of the jeans. The gentleman that had the fashion jeans with 11,000 in sales and $14,000 inventory immediately should double his inventory. And what would happen is his sales would go up, and we'd find the waterline very, very quickly of what he really could do if properly stocked.
Thank you, Paul. I think you may have just addressed our final question here, but I'm going to ask it just in case, because this sounds like two totally different classes. But Andy Minden was asking, how do you address classifications across different seasons, tank tops versus winter coats?
Mark, that's a slow one, over the plate. You want to take that one?
Well, tank tops are actually a year-round class, but they peak at different times. Obviously, spring and summer, it's going to be heavier than fall and winter. Outerwear depends on your location, but it's obviously going to be stronger in the fall and winter. Some stores put jackets in them, which could be year-round. We have a store that blew fleece out in June, and it's on the coast. It's a southern store, and so kind of have to look at the data. It surprised all of us, but obviously, and it's a great question, because you want to have classifications that are seasonal, that are stronger in certain seasons and other seasons. So when you come up with a classification structure, some are going to be year-round, but some are going to obviously be stronger in certain months and other months.
Thank you, Mark. And that's actually great timing. That was our final question, and we are at the hour. Wanted to thank everybody for showing up today. A lot of good information presented here. And again, although this was the 6th of our 6-part series, we do have all 6 sessions available on the link that I included in the chat function, and we are going to send out a recording for this one as well. Like we mentioned before, these are free webinar sessions for the retail community. So if you know somebody that can benefit from this, please feel free and send them the link. We want to make sure that this gets out as far and wide as possible. I wanted to thank Mark and Paul for devoting their time to us today. And again, thank you all for showing up this morning.